Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to a little bit of a change of scenery. Well, I'm actually back in my classroom today. I have to come to school today, unfortunately, to meet smelly old Mr. Wooderson and actually talk to him about curriculum stuff. But it's going to be okay because it gives me enough time to actually use the good internet, and it also gives me enough time to record one of these flips for y'all and to get us to number 3 out of 5, right? So, and it's now currently July 13th, so we are right at about, again, a month out from the first day of school, first day of class. So let's make sure we're staying on a schedule. Let's make sure we're staying on top of things. Make sure we're reading that book, right? Not like loafing our way through it, but actually reading it because it will help you understand everything so much better. And also, it's a pretty large grade. So anyway, all things considered, where we left off talking about last time we were together is we left off talking about the growth of economies during the late Middle Ages, right? Coming out of the high Middle Ages, we discussed how the tragedy of the late Middle Ages is going to actually cause a massive economic boom, which was massively surprising to a lot of people at the time because it was like the plague and the Crusades and the schisms. Oh, excuse me. The schisms and this and that, and the late Middle Ages basically felt like this. Yeah, I know. All right, so, however, ironically enough, the economy of the late Middle Ages, or following the late Middle Ages, is going to feel like this.
Mr. Krabs.
Hello, I like money.
What inspired you to build a second Krusty Krab right next door to the original?
Money. Good morning, my darlings. You're coming home with me.
Very nice, right? So the big thing, though, going forward is we also took a couple of seconds to talk about, like, the big strife between kings and popes and the kind of secular wars that were going on between an ecclesiastical body and a political body, right? And we were going into those things, and we were talking about the growth in the background of these guilds and different items like that, especially the merchant guilds coming out of different areas of Europe. And then we also began to kind of dip our toes into a little bit of this wars between these higher ranking bodies of nobles, kings, and popes, and how that left room for growth of these northern Italian states, right? The big thing we got to get into, though, today is to be able to talk about, like, why them? Like, why? What did the Italian states do that made it possible for them to grow so large, so fast, and so powerful? And I don't mean large by size, but I mean large by power, because here's one of them, there's another one right there when they were controlled by the Holy Roman Empire, and this purple one right here as well. But when you compare them to the rest of the kingdoms of Europe, they're very small, very, very small, right? How did they become the nest egg for the Renaissance and the revival of European culture? Why them? Why these little guys? Well, a lot of it has to do with the growth of different things in these states, right? How they started out trying to avoid monarchical power, how they started out trying to avoid noble power and things like that. And what they started out on was these things called communes, right? So the establishment of the North Italian states in the first place and their rise to power, which we'll be going to one of them this summer when we go to Tuscany and Florence. So the big thing about it, though, is the establishment of these North Italian states and their rise to power all hinged upon the idea of starting these things called communes, right? So communes were a way to try and separate the growing guilds of Europe away from the monarchical powers that were fighting with the Pope at the time, and instead wanted to create states that were based on the idea of sworn associations of free men. This idea that basically the guilds would create their own government, pseudo kind of vote in a way, right? There would be major guilds. I think in Florence that there was like 21 guilds, but 14 of them were smaller and 7 of them were really, really large, right? So, and they wanted freedom from nobles, right? These sworn associations of free men wanted to be able to create their own goods, set their own prices, and function as like in their own government. So that way they could regulate trade, collect taxes, and maintain city walls and defenses, hire militias if they needed to. And they grew very, very politically wealthy, they grew very, very wealthy, but politically unstable as time went on. Now, the thing about it is Milan, Venice, Milan, Venice, Tuscany, aka Florence, are all going to start out as these communistic ideas. Not communist as in Karl Marx, that's different, as in communist as in like in a commune setting. Now, they had different guilds popping up, but to use Florence as an example, it's kind of an ultimate gonna happen in unregulated capitalism. When capitalism is running forward and you have these guilds popping up, and you have these guilds doing different things and making different money and all this other stuff, some of these guilds are going to make more money than others. Like, for example, a barrel makers guild, they have a name and I can never remember what they're called. Let's use a different one. We're going to use a smithing guild. Might not make as much money in Florence as a textile guild, right? Because textiles were actually heavily produced in Florence. There was a lot of wool being created and made and grown, not grown, but raised in Florence. And also in Florence, there was the discovery of this stuff called alum, which actually was a very, very high-priced dye, all right? So the wool merchant guild, because of this, and the wool guilds of Florence grew very, very powerful, very, very large, very, very strong. So they began to exert more power over these smaller guilds. It's kind of an interesting thing when you think about it, because no matter what you try to do, certain groups are going to grow more powerful, and sometimes they're going to hoard money, right? And so what you ended up creating were two new social classes inside of these communes. These things that were started in the late Middle Ages to be these sworn associations of free and equal men turning into social class rife descent in all of these northern Italian states, right? So what you ended up with was these merchant elites, right? So which is like your wool merchants guild of Florence, or your militia guild, or your militias and militia families of Milan, and your shipping guilds of Venice, right? You ended up with the merchant elite, and then you ended up with this other class called the popolo, right? And the popolo were the lower class of guild members of smaller guilds, right? Or they were craft guild members of smaller craft guilds, right? So the thing about it is, you have to understand, is that these merchant elites basically turned into the new nobles, right? The new nobles, aka these merchant elites, instead of owning land, now own massive amounts of commerce, right? And so they make citizenship based on wealth. They try to say, oh, well, your citizenship will be based on how much money you have in this commune. And then if you're not technically a full participatory citizen, then you don't have any say in our government. This was a way to keep merchant elites in power, right? So to give you an example of merchant elites exacting their power, this right here is a city, and I actually took this picture, or no, I didn't take this picture. I got this one off Google, but I have a picture that's almost exactly like this one. Now, this is a city in the north of Italy, and it's actually in Tuscany, and it's a little bit north of Florence, and I've been there before. It's called San Gimignano, right? San Gimignano is a late Middle Ages city that was started in the Italian commune system, and it was actually started in the state of Tuscany right outside of Florence, right? So the big thing about this communistic system, though, is as you can see, is there's a little funky kind of weird thing going on with the skyline here, right? These towers are all built by merchant elite families, right? So when merchant elite families would move into San Gimignano, or when they would make enough money off of their guild membership, they would build a tower. They built their tower to try and show their dominance over the other people inside of the city itself. And then ironically enough, every time another merchant elite family would move in or make a little bit of money, they would build a tower, but they try to build it a little bit taller, right? So, and then the next one would build a tower, would try to build it a little bit taller. So you can even see the growth of merchant elite family class systems in the skyline of a post-medieval city, or a medieval city in Florence, or excuse me, in Tuscany, in this creation of these towers and things. So these merchant elites became these new nobles, right? And then beneath them, the guys that are living down in these regular houses are your popolo, right? Now, you had different types of popolo. It's not as easy to say that these people are this and these people are that. So popolo is of various groups of common people, right? You had some wealthy popolo members that weren't quite wealthy enough to be in the merchant elite, but they were wealthy for the popolo. And they're called the popolo grasso, right? And they represent the common people. They are able to vote. They are citizens by technicality because they have enough wealth, but they don't have enough wealth to kind of curry too much favor over these merchant elites, right? And then you had these other people, the popolo minuto. And the popolo minuto were oftentimes not considered citizens, or were not allowed to vote or be a part of the republican system, or excuse me, be a part of the communistic system of trying to appoint and create these different tax regulations and actually everything else. And then also, out of all of these people, who do you think is being taxed the heaviest? The popolo are, right? The popolo grasso are being taxed very heavily. The popolo minuto are being taxed very, very heavily. And then ironically enough, merchant elites aren't being taxed much at all. So as you can see, this is something that happens in history repeatedly, all right? So, like, people with a lot of money tend to find ways to pay less of it, right? So the big thing about it, though, also going forward, is the Popolo Minuto, these commoners that are disenfranchised and heavily taxed, are going to unite with the Popolo Grosso, and they're going to create a series of revolts, right? So the Popolo are going to start revolting in these Italian communes. Now, some of y'all are like, Mr. Terry, hold up, back it up, back up, wait, Terry, back up, all right? So explain to me really, really quickly, how is it possible that this is going to be the bedrock of the Renaissance if everybody's having violent revolts and the thing that they started out on wasn't even that stable? We're getting there, okay? We're getting there. And a lot of it has to do with the kind of thing that was left behind after these revolts faded away, right? So these violent revolts are sometimes called the Chianti revolts or the Ciampi revolts. The goals of these uprisings, the goals of these revolts was to create true republican systems. Now, republics hadn't been seen since ancient Rome, okay? And ironically enough, a true republic hadn't been seen in ancient Rome since, give or take, about 48 BC, right, when Julius Caesar actually destroyed the armies of Pompey in their civil war. Now, the interesting part about this also is that they want to create this republic in the guile and the idea and the zealous idea of the former Roman Empire. But funny enough, they kind of got what they wanted because of this is the difference. What a republic is between what the commune government was that the Republican government is supposed to be where power rests in the hands of people, where all people are given voting rights, where they can vote to decide to banish people if they so choose. For example, if a merchant elite family is getting too powerful, the Popolo could vote to banish them out of their commune, right? So that is what they wanted. That is what the Popolo wanted, was to create this kind of republic idea. Now, the hard part about it is the merchant elite are not stupid. They're not dumb, and they figure out a way to make the Popolo believe that's what they're getting, right? And so what the merchant elite are going to do, of course, because they have this massive wealth and they have all of this funding, they hire mercenary armies to take down these revolts. Now, this is a very important thing, mercenary armies. What a mercenary army is, it's an army for hire, all right? Some of the most famous mercenary armies, guys, to remember, and you're reading about them, and they're brought up multiple times in Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling by Ross King, are Swiss mercenaries, right? Julius II hires Swiss mercenaries very often to help fund and make an army, right? So Swiss or mercenaries from Switzerland are very, very well trained, apparently, and they're also apparently a very, very strong military unit, right? And so merchant elites are gonna hire mercenary armies to take down the Ciampi revolts, and the government is going to develop into these things known as signorias, right? Signorias, which literally means lordly power, is a very weird thing. So what they did basically is they created these republics, right? Inside of the communes, they created organizations of the guilds and mushed them together, and basically created grand councils, right? These grand councils would appoint leaders because they were voted upon by other people in the other minor guilds into these grand councils. The grand councils would then vote on who the signori was, right? The signori, what it ended up being was the wealthiest people in each of these states. That's why they're a fake republic. They're not true. They're not technically real, right? But the Popolo believed they were getting what they wanted because they were getting more voting rights, than tax regulation was coming about a little bit better, right? So these fake republics were mostly ran by one single family, and they were semi-dynastic, which means that literally when a man died, his son would take over, bribe the guild members into voting him back into power, and then basically he would just be rising up as this new king of these communes, right? So it's not a true republic, it's a very, very fake one. And signori or signoria is a very important word. You should highlight it, star it, make it look like it's very, very big and important, okay? So going forward, though, you've got the rise of these families, right? Now, if we're going to talk about these families, you've got to know exactly who they are. Big examples are the Sforza in Milan and the Medici in Florence, right? So the Medici are right here, and this is the Sforza family after they combined with the Viscontis, right? So the Viscontis were actually the original rulers of Milan, right? They were a very, very large family that made a ton of money as a mercenary hiring family and an actual, basically conglomerating several guilds together, and they would use their money to hire mercenary armies, and they would exact power in that method, right? So the Visconti, though, their children are going to end up dying with no heirs, and then Francesco I Sforza is going to marry their last daughter and combine the two families together, and the Sforza are going to take over inside of Milan. So this is the Sforza crest, this is the Visconti crest, and you can see when they married together, the two of them combined together, right? And this right here is the Medici crest, right? These are actually supposed to represent oranges or orbs, and this right here, some of you are like, that looks French! All right, well it is, because later on, the Medicis are going to marry into the French crown. Not yet, but they will later. But this is the crest of the Medici family, right? So the important thing to understand, though, going forward, is these signorias and these revolts thought they had accomplished a lot, but they actually hadn't accomplished as much as they thought. The merchant elites backed off on the taxation a little bit to keep the popolo happy, but they were still basically ruling everything from behind the scenes in this methodization known as a signoria, right? So now we're going to go over the three big cities. The first one is Milan, right? So Milan is a modern-day kind of example of what it always has been. It is a midway point geographically at the time between the Holy Roman Empire and, between the HRE, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian economy. This is supposed to say Italian, not Rome. That's dumb. All right, so the Italian economy, okay? So basically, as these goods are being brought in from the Byzantine Empire into Italy, and then they're being parceled out to the rest of Europe, Milan is the city that all goods had to pass through, right? And so Milan makes most of its money out of its geographical standpoint, the fact that it was a trade hub, right? Also, it had some manufacturing, some textile production, and things like that. Their government, though, was ran by the Visconti and the Sforza families, these mercenary rulers. This right here is Francesco I Sforza, and he is later going to be conquered by Philip II of Spain, who is crazy important later on. Now, the thing about Milan is this is all we're going to talk about Milan. Milan is there as a very powerful place, militarily speaking and geographically speaking, and they do come into play every now and again. But out of the three big Renaissance states, they're kind of the third-ranked one, right? We're going literally 3, 2, 1, okay? We're going in the rankings of the lowest one, which is Milan, and Milan was very powerful, and it's going to exact a lot of retribution, especially when they actually hire or convince this French king, Charles VIII, to invade all of Italy. We'll get to that stuff a little bit later on when we talk about Girolamo Savonarola. We'll talk about all that. But Milan is not as powerful or as wave-making as the other two, right? So now the next guys, though, super important, right? There's Francesco. So the big thing about Venice is that, 1, yes, it's gorgeous. 2, yes, it's gorgeous. 3, yes, this is the stereotype of Venice. So all of you have seen clips of Venice before, the canals, the gondolas, you've all seen that stuff, right? The thing about Venice, though, and the reason why they were so important in these northern Italian states has to do with the fact that they were basically the shipment people of these Italian communistic states, or these Italian republics, right? They are the trade empire of Italy. They are very, very large, and they dominate trade in the Mediterranean. As you can see, they literally cornered the market on anything coming through the Adriatic Sea or through the Mediterranean. Now, some of you are like, what about the Kingdom of Naples and people like that? The Kingdom of Naples were too busy fighting with the Pope and actually exacting wars, and they had too much agriculture being created in these areas to actually create as many harbors or actually to run nearly as much. Also due to the fact that the two empires that existed right here created specific trade embargoes with Venice, because Venice was like, look, you will pay and ship with us only, and we will make sure that we are doing this for you for cheap, right? So Venice underbid everybody else. Venice would sail its vessels all the way through to here, to Constantinople, later on, which would be called Istanbul, when the Ottomans would take over. But the interesting factoid and the interesting thing about this is Venice created trade embargoes with the Byzantine and with the Ottoman Empire, right? And so the way that they do this, or the reason why they do this, is they manipulate the Byzantine and the Ottomans to make it so they're the only people bringing in those Eastern luxury goods, the silks, the teas, the porcelains, the this, the that, the warehouse inventory items, right? They are also completely autonomous. they remained separate from the HRE, and they actually stayed a pretty legit pseudo-fake republic, Signoria. The interesting thing about Venice, though, is that they weren't controlled by one family. They were actually controlled by several, right? Their merchant guild council actually ruled from behind the scenes and did a very, very good job of making sure that as long as we are economically profitable, the people will be happy. As long as we don't overtax them, they won't revolt again. And so Venice actually stayed very autonomous and very, very strong for a very, very long time until they were later on conquered by the Austrians, right? So now the biggest thing, though, is they are a shining example of the Renaissance economy, and they are a major figure in the late Renaissance period, but we'll go more on that a little bit later, all right? So not so much right now, but these guys, when we're talking Renaissance, when we're talking Renaissance humanism, we're almost always talking about one of my favorite places in the entire world, the place of which we'll be going in summer, and I can't wait. I'm dying inside. If some of your parents need more convincing, please know that there's going to be a meeting coming up right when school starts back, and I'll do my best to convince them to let you go. But the cradle of the Renaissance is Florence, right? Florence, the capital of the county of Tuscany in northern Italy, established by Julius Caesar as an area for retired veterans, patroned by the Medici, and so which is some of the most wealthy guilds in Europe, and some of the most wealthy guilds in Europe. You have to understand that it's a beautiful, beautiful place. But before we get to the pretty pictures, and before you see how gorgeous of a city I'm talking about here, you have to understand who these people are. The Medici put Florence on the map. The Medici also set the standard of what a patron in the Renaissance would be, okay? Florence is known as the cradle of the Renaissance because it is believed to be the most outward example of the Renaissance, right? The clothing, the economy, the art, the architecture, the explosion of different items and sculptures and frescoes and things and artists coming out of this one city and one area kind of gives you they're the guiding light. They're the torchbearer of the Renaissance. They are the cradle of the Renaissance, right? Now, what the Medici was a very strong and powerful family started by this guy named Cosimo the Elder, right? And you'll actually see, if you come with us, you'll see a statue of him actually in the Palazzo del Vecchio. He's on the back of a horse, and he's the patriarch of the Medici family, right? He started this thing, the Medici Bank, okay? So the Medici family came up with the most insanely amazing idea on the planet. Now that money was coming into Italy heavily, right? So you've got a ton of money coming in through Venice, a ton of money coming in through Milan, and a ton of money coming into Florence for its textiles and its textile systems, and then also its architectural systems, its marble mining systems, and different things like that. So really quickly, but what kind of money are we talking about here? Money during the Renaissance is literal liquidated gold. It is actual gold. It is funded money. It is physical. It is not a debit card. It is not numbers on a screen. If you have been paid for something, you've been given one of these, a florent, right? So a florent was the actual currency of Florence, right? So Cosimo the Elder came up with this concept where he was like, wait a second. You can't just keep all this money in your house. If you keep all this money in your house burns down, your money's gone. Well, not really. It's going to melt, though, and what are you going to do with it, right? So if it's going to get dirt in it, it's gross. So, the big thing, though, he was like, you need somewhere to store all of this money. How about you come to my building, my bank, which is secure, is defended by mercenaries, and it has a very large vault in the back, and we will keep your money safe. And the people are like, well, how am I going to get my money back? And they're like, oh, that's just the thing. You just come and see me, and I will give you your money back. And Cosimo's sitting there stroking that menacing mustache and beard combo, and people are like, wait, so you'll keep my money safe? And he's like, yes, I will. And they're like, how do you make money, though? And he's like, don't worry about that. I'll figure it out. The thing about it is Cosimo spent their money, all right? Because here's the intense idea about a bank. When you give money to a bank, they spend it, all right? So they use it. They spend it. They have to, right? Because they have to keep their lights on. They have to pay the plumber. They have to pay the air conditioning guy. They got to pay people with these things, right? So the Cosimo is going to start realizing, wait a second. Not only can I spend their money for myself, I can also loan their money to other people and charge that person interest, money on their money, to allow themselves to have this money, right? So if I got a loan from the Medici Bank, I have to pay him extra money on top of that loan in the form of interest to borrow this money. Ironically enough, though, I just am using like Abigail Winningham's money that she gave to Cosimo, and we're all just hoping and praying that all of us don't show up at the exact same time, right? And we'll talk about that stuff a little bit more in the later on, but basically the entire concept of the Medici Bank just worked upon the idea that not everyone would show up the same day and ask for their money back, right? So, and they never did, right? So this actually became a very, very fully funded thing. And they became, under Cosimo, the Signoria family of Florence, right? And then his son, Il Magnifico, Lorenzo de' Medici, after, of course, there was another one that was Piero de' Medici, but Piero apparently had a hunchback and all this other stuff, and like whatever. We'll get to that later on. So Lorenzo de' Medici, who is, I believe, the grandson of Cosimo the Elder, is going to rise up and become the Renaissance patron of Florence. And under his rule, powerful banks would be created. Money was there in excess and was ready to be spent on artists and their artwork and their creations and their different items and architects and different things like that. And under the Medici family, Florence, this beautiful city, this picture taken from the Michelangelo or Palazzo del Michelangelo, right? So this is where Michelangelo is from, blossomed into this amazing example of the Renaissance, right? Right here, this is Brunelleschi's dome on top of the Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, the biggest building on purpose in Florence. This right here is the home of the Medici, that is the Palazzo della Signoria, and like all these other amazing, beautiful things on the banks of the Arno. This is my wife and I. In front of the Santa Maria del Fiore, the Brunelleschi's dome is like right up there. It's being worked on at the time. And then this right here, of course, is the baptismal font, and this is the Brunelleschi's dome again as well. This is the Palazzo della Signoria where the Medicis lived, and this is one of the most famous sculptures to come out of Florence. That is Cellini's Perseus holding the head of Medusa, right? So, and we'll talk about Cellini a little bit more later on, but this is actually in the Medici Sculpture Garden, which is actually originally where the David was placed. The original Michelangelo's David was actually placed in that same sculpture garden, but it's a beautiful city. It's breathtaking. I almost cried when I had to leave. It's something else. Like it's an amazing thing. And here is the second city we'll be going to this summer. But what about Rome, right? What about Rome in Northern Europe? Where are they in this whole play-out thing? What are they doing? Well, the thing about Rome in Northern Europe is they're still very powerful because basically what we're asking ourselves in a nutshell is what's going on while these communes are growing, while Florence, Milan, and Italy are growing Florence, Milan, and Venice are growing very, very powerful during this time period. What is Rome, which is where the Papal States and the Pope are, and Northern Europe, the other group that they're kind of constantly fighting against, what are they doing? Well, just to give you a heads up, Rome is the Papal States, right? So the middle area of Italy is called the Papal States. It's ruled over by the Pope and from the seat of Rome, okay? And they ruled over by each new pope. Their priorities are going to be focused on the expansion of territory, bringing in foreign governments under their thumb. And what I mean under their thumb is they are trying to create a more systematic approach to creating monarchs that are loyal to a pope rather than being loyal to themselves, so they can use those monarchs and those armies to attack other non-relenting monarchs, for example, right? So we're going to talk about one of the big ones here later on. And the best examples, some of the best examples of Renaissance art are going to be located inside of Rome, right? Because this is not to try and like thumb our nose at Rome in any way during this time period. Florence, Milan, and Venice are making a ton of money for their size, okay? But Rome still has more money than it will ever know what to do with, right? So because their money is coming in and a massive, massive funding through the expansion of this thing called the tithe, right? So the tithe, or what the tithe is a 10% donation to the church that every person is supposed to give from their bank account, from the money they earned in a week every Sunday, right? So every bit of that money from every person all over Europe, including these big economies coming from northern Italy, including the larger economies in northern Europe, including people like the Habsburg family, because Catholicism is the only type of Christianity in Europe at this time. Well, not technically. There were the Hussites, but we'll talk about them later on. So the tithe is going into it's just being directly injected into Rome. So here's the thing. If the tithe was large in the High Middle Ages, and then the economy exploded after the Late Middle Ages, what's going to happen to the tithe? It's a percentage. So as more money is being made in Europe, more money is going to be being collected by the church, right? And because of this, some of the best examples of Renaissance art are located there due to the wealth of the church as they began to grow in insane levels. The Vatican museums are beautiful. The Vatican itself, St. Peter's Basilica, is a Renaissance building designed by Donato Bramante, the guy that hates Michelangelo's guts in Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, right? So Bramante can't stand him. He designed St. Peter's Basilica, and then ironically enough, Michelangelo later on, after Bramante's dead, is going to design a dome that goes on top of the basilica that the entire building is most well known for. Now, anyway, but I don't know if he did that on purpose, but who knows. However, the School of Athens is located in the Vatican now, inside the Vatican Museum. The Sistine Chapel itself is in Rome, right? So, all of these things are located in Rome. Well, so Rome is very, very well funded, has a ton of money, but it's not territorially massive, right? It doesn't rule over as many people as some of the northern European countries do. Northern European countries are turning into what we now know as nation states. They're very slowly forming into nation states, i.e. France, England, places that are kind of denoted by their cultures, their languages, stuff like that. Dominant power, though, is still being held by dynastic families. For example, during this time period, during the Renaissance, you've got who is in England, all right? So it's the late 1300s, 1400s. So we've got 100 Years' War raging on. And by 1450, you've got the War of the Roses is going to erupt eventually. And then you've got the death of the Plantagenets and then the growth of the Yorks, the Lancasters, and the Tudors, right? So going on in England. And so you've got these families growing there. In France, you've got, who's there? The Valois. The Valois family is ruling over everything in France, right? So the dominant powers are being held inside of these individual families. When a king dies, his son is to take over, right? Well, the biggest one, the strongest one, the most crazy powerful family out of all of them in Northern Europe were these ones known as the Habsburgs, right? Spelled H-A-P-S-B-U-R-G if you're saying it in one language, spelled H-A-B-S-B-U-R-G if you're saying it in another language. But the Habsburgs are Austrian royals, right? They are from the Austrian city of Vienna. I have been to their house, the Schönbrunn Palace, and they reign supreme inside of the Holy Roman Empire, right? They rule over the Holy Roman Empire using their wealth and this thing's called marriages of convenience. So the Habsburgs were a step ahead of the game, okay? The Habsburgs used money that they were making based off of, how did they make their money? I can never remember. Well, I think it's land holdings and noble lineage. But so the Habsburgs end up making a ton of money in the Middle Ages, right? And what they begin to do is they slowly begin to usurp power throughout all of Europe by gobbling up different families through different marriages, right? So the biggest way to show this is by showing you how this worked, right? So you have Maximilian I. Now, Maximilian I is the very first Holy Roman Emperor from the Habsburg family. He's going to go off and marry a woman named Anne of Burgundy, right? Anne of Burgundy is a noble woman from the western area of France, right? So they're going to have a child named Philip the Handsome, all right? So, and Philip the Handsome, who's not very handsome, is going to eventually marry Joanna the Mad, right? Joanna the Mad is a princess from Spain, okay? So, wait a second. Let's back it up again really quick. So he owns Austria, controls Austria, and he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Because he's voted on by it. We'll get to Charles V and how Holy Roman Emperors are selected later on. But he's the Holy Roman Emperor, right? He is selected by a group of electors, right? So, and they voted him in. So he comes in, he marries a woman from France who owns most of eastern France, right? So now he not only owns Austria, now he also owns a huge chunk of eastern France, right? So then his son, who now also owns Austria and a huge chunk of eastern France, goes off and marries the princess from Spain to integrate his DNA into the Spanish crown, right? And so then that guy is going to be born, and that's Charles V, who's going to now end up owning Eastern France, all of the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, and then also Spain on top of it, right? So that's the marriages of convenience. They would find royal families when they had only a daughter left and usually married their male heirs into it. Now, here's what got really weird, though. As the Habsburgs started going on, then they started marrying each other's cousins and things like that, which was really gross. So they started marrying a lot of cousins. Every single time that you see a crossover line, it means that that's somebody marrying one of their offspring. And what ended up happening to the Habsburgs is they ended up dying later on, dying out because of incest-related problems. This is the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. That's Carlos II. We'll talk about him a little bit later on as well, but basically this guy was so genetically deformed by the 1700s. By the 1700s, the Habsburgs are going to rule over Northern Europe, though, from, from like 1450 all the way up until 1710. And so, like, you're talking about an insane amount of ruling time, 300 years. But by that point, by the time 1710 rolls around, he ended up with kids that looked like this. And Carlos II, the last king of Spain, he couldn't talk until he was 4, couldn't walk until he was 8. He had a constant drool because Habsburgs became very, very well known for one facial abnormality. And jot this down, it's called the Habsburg jaw, right? And it's because basically they would have the biggest unbite ever. They would just look like this. All right, but anyway, that's where we're going to leave off for today. I'll talk to you guys soon. Y'all have a good one.